Welcome to Chats with Chelsi. I'm your host, Chelsi Bennett. Thanks for tuning in this week. We are continuing our discussion on mental health awareness. This week, with a different lens. My friend Elizabeth Key sits down to discuss her journey and the grieving process of losing her brother to a heroin overdose. Let's tune in. Well, welcome to Chats with Chelsi. I'm so glad you're here, Elizabeth. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Chelsi. I'm glad to be here also. So about me, I'm from Atlanta originally.
Southern girl.
Yeah. I told my parents I only wanted to look at schools in Virginia, and they were nice enough to humor me on that. And so I ended up at William & Mary in Williamsburg. And my college roommate, who's still a dear friend, is from Arlington, Virginia. And so a couple years after graduation, she was moving back to Arlington, and we were sort of talking about, wouldn't it be fun if we lived together again? And so I moved from Atlanta to Arlington and have been there ever since.
Wow. So DC, Arlington, what we know up here as the DMV area, have you fallen in love with it? Or like, you know, I'm still new. I'm 3 years in.
Yes. So I can distinctly remember telling family members, oh, I'll be up there a year and a half or 2 years. And next week is 19 years. So I think it agrees with me, or I agree with it, or something. Yeah.
Well, I'm so grateful that you decided to share some of your journey and your story with the Chats with Chelsi community. I'm grateful because I can only imagine the pain you and your family have felt for the past 3 years. But I'm also hopeful that throughout our conversation today and in the coming weeks that it will be a source of empowerment and healing for those who have encountered something similar.
I hope so too.
So let's jump right in. A few years ago, you lost your brother.
I did.
To a drug overdose.
I did. So I was in New York for work. I had just landed and was in a cab, and my phone rang, and it was my mom calling me to tell me that my brother had died. And we had known for about a year that he had struggled with a heroin addiction. And so it wasn't entirely surprising, except it's so out of the blue, and you know, like I had no idea. I had seen him the weekend before, and I was in New York for this work trip, and you know, you just sort of, life is going along, and then this giant thing lands in your lap, and you've got to figure out how to navigate that.
So you all had known for a year about the addiction. How did you find out? How did you find out?
So I'm the oldest of three. My brother was in the middle, and my sister was the youngest. And just the way with who started school when and late birthdays and all of that, the two of them were really close. We're pretty evenly spaced, but we're closer in school. And so they ended up having a ton of the same friends. They both are artists, and so have this artist heart and all of these you know, this really funky collection of friends and their support network. And so it was really my sister who was the one who kind of figured it out and convinced him to go into rehab.
Okay.
So he had done that, but you know, something that I'd read subsequently is that morphine is the most addictive molecule that we know.
Okay.
And something else that I've read is that the estimates are that really to rewire your brain after it's developed an addiction would take about 2 years of inpatient treatment.
2 years?
And 2 years.
2 full years.
2 full years of inpatient treatment to rewire. And so in my particular case, but we as sort of a country and a community in dealing with addiction in general, but specifically opioid addiction, are really far from in treatment options from where we need to be.
From what lines up with the science is what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
So when you found out, so you know, thank you for taking us through of how you all found out about his addiction. But when you heard about it, I mean, he was your younger brother.
Right. So again, so I was in New York, and I've got a bunch of friends in New York. I've got a bunch of coworkers, but the first thing I thought, and I was still in the cab, was like, I've got to get to a church. And it didn't matter if it was my denomination or I just needed to be in that sacred space. And I mean, it was like a visceral need to be in a church. And so I got to the hotel where I was staying, just dropped my suitcase and then ran out to find a church. And I ended up at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, which is a huge tourist attraction. Somebody was doing mass and somebody was doing a rehearsal for a wedding, and there was a tourist group, but it gave me that little bit of peace that I needed right then at that moment, or sort of the safe space that I needed.
For the year that you knew about his addiction, he went to rehab. Tell us more about that journey and what that experience was for you as his older sister.
Yep. And so that's, I was, he lived in Atlanta. My parents are in Atlanta. My sister's in Atlanta. And so that was, hard sort of being away when all of this was happening. And I remember writing him a letter right at the very beginning, and that just said, he was born before I was 3, and so I don't remember a time where I wasn't, where big sister wasn't part of your identity. And I remember writing him a letter and just saying, not saying you have to do this because of me, but just saying you are an important part of my identity, and I can't imagine my life without you, because I don't remember a life without you. And he actually did remarkably well initially, and we don't know what triggered the relapse, and we'll never know. And it doesn't matter at this point, other than to the extent that we want to help another family that's going through this. But it's I don't want to. I have really tried not to get into a space of blaming anyone or blaming. I don't know, and I don't want to blame whatever or whoever caused the relapse, and so that's just not constructive thinking to me.
So I have to ask along those lines, when you did find out a year prior, did you feel guilty, ashamed, or responsible at all for him being addicted to heroin?
No, I don't think so. So my family has some history of substance abuse, alcoholism. Not my immediate family, but I've got a great-grandfather. So it wasn't entirely surprising. I think the thing that was hardest for me is that he seemed, even sort of leading into it, he seemed so sort of sad and angry. Okay. And that's really, and you can't make somebody not feel sad or angry, but that's really the part that sort of hurts my heart, that whatever pain he was going through that led him down this path. And he said to my sister when this was starting, he said, I know this is not the family we were raised into. I know that I should be better than this. I mean, so he definitely was carrying the guilt and so then it's not, my role then, knowing he feels that, is to be supportive and loving and not yeah.
How was it for your sister and your parents during that year process of being, it's real, it's in front of you. My brother, my son is addicted. This is what's happening.
I think all of us really, it's just sort of this waiting game of what's going to happen, or is something going to happen, and just kind of not knowing. And it was probably only about a week before he died that I was at a funeral for the wife of a friend of mine, and the ringer on my phone was off, but I hadn't turned the phone all the way off, and so I could hear the phone vibrating in my bag while I was at this funeral. And I thought so clearly, that is someone calling to tell me my brother has died. And it wasn't. It was the dentist calling to confirm an appointment. But that too, and again, this was really only maybe a week before this happened. I hadn't really realized sort of how on edge I had been kind of expecting that. And again, the science is pretty discouraging on recovery rates from heroin. It's the odds are really stacked against you.
Did you find out why heroin?
My sister has a theory. I don't know if it's true or not, and I don't. Yeah.
So, but let's talk about that, because I think that is something that could be helpful. Is that you found out that your brother was addicted to heroin. And from what I'm hearing, you didn't interrogate him with 15 million questions about how, why, and when.
No.
Why? Why not?
Because it's so my grandmother, when she turned 90, wrote 9 life lessons learned over 9 decades. And the number one life lesson that she learned or shared is make peace with reality. And at that point, the reality was he was addicted. And it didn't then really matter who had introduced him to it or when the first time he tried it was, or because it's sort of like that's no longer the critical issue. The critical issue is you've got somebody who, because of the sadness and the anger or whatever was going on with him, felt like this was what he needed to do, and then so you're trying to address that. But no, it's if you really, and it's hard to think of addiction as a disease. It's sort of easy for us to say addiction is a disease, but when you start breaking it down and thinking of the actual consuming of something that you know is bad for you, that's hard to think of that as being really miswired brain chemistry versus willpower. And so I really wanted to be careful not to start, going down the road of interrogating, because that starts, I think, making the person feel like you are sort of going down that willpower road when that's not actually what's going on. It's just sort of hard for us who don't deal with that really to get our heads wrapped around it.
So you believe addiction is a disease?
I do. I think it's I think there is, and especially in the case of heroin, where your brain actually rewires so that it is constantly seeking that high that you get from it. And that's why, some of the things that I've read have said this 2 years of inpatient rehab, that to rewire your brain's pleasure and reward pathways takes that long. And unfortunately, developing addiction is nearly instantaneous.
Right.
So it's this very short term and then a long time to undo the damage.
So we've talked about how you found out about his passing the year before. What's that been like? I have to say that I love one of the 9 lessons that your grandmother left behind, because I'll share, I'm not there yet, just in terms of that lesson of making peace with reality. I can tell you, my brother, he would probably say I'm an interrogator, because he'll tell me something and I'll ask 15 million questions. But I definitely hear, obviously a different circumstance, but hear the lesson that your grandmother left that is just resonating with me of, I'm asking all these questions as if it's going to change.
Right.
And then as I also sit back and think about just possibly those feelings, I can only imagine and empathize with you. But for me, in even some of the situations I've been in and I've interrogated someone, how selfish that is of me when I think about the fact that they've already made whatever choice that is, and to get to that place of, I may not want this to be my reality,
but it is
at this moment, and how do I love them? And I love that you said that your role was to love and to support him.
Right. Well, and that's, and sort of the grief of that is going to be uniquely personal, and everyone for every loss is going to react differently. And I should say, I did not feel like I needed to seek professional help, but certainly that is whether it's grief counseling or therapy or, that is an avenue for everyone, or that everyone should be open to everyone. But I, sort of along the same lines with the Make Peace with Reality, I decided that I not was going to find the joy in it, because this was by nature not a joyful experience, but that I was really going to look for moments of grace, is really what I called them, throughout. And it was everything from, because I had been in New York for work, and so I had to call the travel agent to get get my plane ticket changed and get a flight to Atlanta, and like that was smoother than it should have. So it was sort of everything from that to I have a friend who drove down from Nashville to Atlanta and for the funeral, and she told me later, she said, you couldn't see this because you were in the front, but the line of people going out for communion was this lovely mix of artist Black, because my brother and sister had this whole awesome community of artist friends, and church Black. And she said it was breathtaking seeing like all of these people who wouldn't normally cross paths celebrating this life. And my mom had said, she said, I don't think anybody is really going to come to the funeral. And my brother was raised in the church but wasn't active as an adult, and most of his friend community was not, and it was packed. And so it's all of these things that along the way I would of course trade all of them to have more time with my brother,
right.
But it was finding the beauty in this really dark time. And it's, people say this, but you don't really know until you are going through it. They'll say, people that you didn't really know were your friends will show up for you in unexpected ways. And there are people that you would expect to respond who don't, and that it really helps you sort of evaluate friendships and relationships. And again, not in a way that you would have chosen to do, but it's, a lot of beauty in a dark time.
I like the moments of grace, and that you evaluated, you were honest and real with yourself about the help that you need.
Right.
Therapy and professional help is something that's very important to me, to encourage the Chats with Chelsi community to not be afraid of it.
Right, absolutely.
So tell us though, so you had these moments of grace that you were looking for. It's been 3 years, and as you said, grief is, it affects us differently, yet there are some clear lines between healthy and unhealthy grief.
Yeah.
Tell us how you continued along this track in a healthy manner where you haven't had to seek professional help.
One of the things that I've done, and again, this worked for me, there may be somebody else for whom this doesn't work, but I got a notebook and I started jotting down things that I would have texted him.
Wow.
And it even sometimes includes, like if I had read an article in the newspaper, it's a 3-ring binder where I just wrote down all of these things. And so if there was an article from the newspaper, like I just tucked that in those pages. And, when it first happened, it was like I would be texting him, once, twice, 3 times a day when, oh, you would have thought this was so funny, or, oh, this would have made you so mad, or, whatever. And as time has gone on, I find that I need to do that less and less. And it doesn't mean that I don't think of him every day, but it just sort of means I've learned how to live with, like, the brother-shaped hole in my heart. And so I've just kind of navigated that, but that was really helpful for me, especially initially, just having sort of a way to feel still connected to him again, especially because this was pretty sudden that, I had seen him 3 days before I got this call.
I've asked this question a different way, but I want to ask it this way. do you ever feel that there was something different you should have done? You loved him, you supported him, you wrote the letter, but do you ever, as you went through this 3-year process and the journey continues, has that thought come, I should have did this?
I think the only, I'm generally not a person who focuses on regret. I feel like that's sort of a wasted emotion. But if I had a regret on this, I think, and you actually just alluded to this, so it kind of ties back nicely. I think if I were doing it again, I might have pushed harder on, you seem sad, you seem angry, and this would have been 5 years, 10 years before all of this happened. You know, you might consider professional help. You might, is there, you know, do you think that could work for you? And that would be really the only thing that I think I might have been a little bit more vocal or a little bit more aggressive on if I were doing it again.
That's powerful. And I say that's powerful because I can speak from my life experiences and stories of other women who've sat across, in that sometimes we find ourselves where we're not assertive,
right,
or aggressive with the ones we love to keep the peace, even if it may be the best thing that we could say to them.
Right.
And so
well, and I think you're on point on that. And I also think mental health conversations are really tough for us to have, whether it's somebody we are related to or not. It's hard to say to somebody, you seem depressed, I think you should go get checked out, because I'm not an expert on depression, and so am I really qualified to say to that person, you know, and this is all sort of tied in together, I think, in the way that our brains work or don't work, in, you know, depression or in mental illness or in an addiction, which is a brain, you know, that it's all really tied in together. And I find often that we are not really comfortable talking about that.
You're right. In October of this year, we did a series on Chats with Chelsi for Mental Health Month. 3 incredible ladies sat here and told their journeys, yet I can share from my personal experience of having anxiety and depression, and most recently depression when I moved here, is, to your point, those who are closest to you are the best ones to tell you.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily that you have to have this full clinical definition of what that mental health, but they are the closest to you to know when something's different.
Right.
Just so many powerful moments. So as we're closing, around this time, you were leading the Junior League of Washington, D.C. What was that like, Elizabeth?
It's sort of looking back on it, I think, I don't really know how I did this, where it's this extreme high, where it was this joy of doing this position for an organization that I love, and it was so exciting, and then this extreme low sort of at the same point, and trying to balance those out. And you know, the needs of the one are everyday and sort of constant, and the needs and public, and the needs of the other are sort of everyday and constant but very private. And I think there are a couple things that helped. I do think the writing the text, I think that really helped. And there are even a couple of Junior League texts in there of like, oh, you would have thought this was so funny, or I saw an artist at our holiday market that you would have really liked, or, you know, so it's like those sort of intertwined, even though he was no longer there. And another thing that helped, I had a friend who was the president of the Junior League of Birmingham at the same time, and she had lost her father suddenly. So I had lost my brother a month before the years, a month after the year started. She had lost her father a month before the year started. And so having somebody else who could help navigate that, and then what we were both worried about too was at the end of the year, when you had kind of filled this year with all of this activity, would on June 1st, when that year roll ended, would the grief come rushing back in, and would that, sort of knock both of us to our knees? Unfortunately for both of us, that didn't happen, but it just made all of the difference having somebody who was kind of, traveling that same path. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What are your tips to a sister, a mom, a brother, an auntie, a friend who is dealing with the grief of losing someone they love to a drug overdose?
I think give yourself a lot of grace. I talked about moments of grace, but there was maybe 2 months after this, I took a week off, a vacation week, and I didn't do one thing but, lie on my sofa and watch terrible TV and movies and just walk all around the city. And I know my mother, bless her, was a little bit worried that, does that mean you're depressed?
Yes.
Does that mean, but I just needed some space to kind of grow back into myself. That I had these conflicting roles at the high of junior league and the low of my brother, and I just needed a little time to find me again in that. So give yourself grace and give yourself the space. If you need to sleep late, if you need to take a week off, do that. I do think whether you do the text or whether you're journaling, or I think something to help get out the emotions, I really think you have to do that. It doesn't even matter if you ever go back and read it, but just the outlet when things get bad. And I think too, just know that, and this was probably a year and a half after he had died. I came home. I had a long day at work, gone to the grocery store. I came back home and I realized I had bought the wrong butter, and I just burst into tears. And it was not about the butter, obviously. It was just, for whatever reason, like that day, he was really on my heart, and it just sort of happened. And so I think you have to know that the grief will hit you at times that you don't expect, and that sometimes at times that aren't convenient. It may be in the grocery store or at work or when you're on the treadmill at the gym, and you just kind of have to roll with it. Like, it's all normal, and your grief is unique to you, and so wherever it is taking you, you just have to sort of go along for the ride. Now, again, if you feel like it's taking you into a really dark place where you need to get professional help, by all means do that. But just, I think really and this is trite, but the tip is, you don't get over it, but you find a way to live with it. And that's why I call it the brother-shaped hole in my heart. That it's still there. It'll always be there. But the hole and I have figured out a way to coexist.
Elizabeth, thank you for sharing your story, your journey.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm glad to do it. I hope it can help somebody else.
Loss is never easy. Grief is a normal process that we all go through when we've lost something of significance, a person, even sometimes a job. We grieve. Grieving is natural. What's important for those of you who may be grieving, especially as we approach the holiday season, is knowing the difference between healthy and unhealthy ways of grieving. Later this week on my blog, I'll be sharing healthy ways to grieve and how you can identify if you are going through grief but going towards an unhealthy path. I want you to grieve. I want you to heal and thrive. And as Elizabeth shared, she will always have that brother-sized hole in her heart. So the grief process isn't to forget that person that you've lost, but it is to allow you to mourn and be able to move on in life in a way that is healthy, and so that you can continue to thrive in all that God has called you to do. I encourage you to join us back here next week as we wrap up season 3 of Chats with Chelsi. Elizabeth will be sharing the stigmas around losing a loved one to a heroin overdose and how she's overcome them. Yes, there's stigmas around losing someone to drugs, to a substance. There are stigmas, but she talks about how she has overcome them. So join us back here next week, and share this with someone who may be grieving or have lost a loved one. The holiday seasons are coming up, and for many of us, it's filled with joy and laughter, but for others, it's a time where they remember the person who's not sitting around that Thanksgiving table or at the Christmas tree. So let's be sure we keep them in prayer. I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great week.